The fluorescent lights of the courthouse hallway hummed, a stark contrast to the elegant, albeit sterile, ambience of my office. At 34, I'd always considered myself a pragmatic, level-headed litigator, a master of logic and the fine print. Emotions, I'd learned, were best left outside the courtroom. But then, I met a client named Daniel, a street artist with a whirlwind of passionate energy, and my carefully constructed world began to tilt on its axis. He was a defendant in a bizarre vandalism case involving a rogue mural and a very litigious art collector. Daniel, with his paint-splattered clothes, perpetually messy hair, and eyes that sparkled with an almost childlike wonder, was the antithesis of everything I represented. He was also facing jail time, and that was enough to make me take him on. I met him for the first time in one of the drab conference rooms, the stark white walls a backdrop to his explosion of colors. He wasn't in a suit, he was in a stained t-shirt and ripped jeans, the same outfit he was wearing on the day he was arrested. He sat hunched over, not quite meeting my gaze, but I could tell the arrest had changed him. It hadn't dampened his energy, it was more like a cage he had been forced into. As I started explaining the legal complexities of the case, he would nod occasionally, but his eyes seemed to be drifting towards the window, where, I assumed, he would rather be. "Mr. Hayes," I said, my voice deliberately calm to match the controlled tone of the room, "do you understand the gravity of the charges?" He finally turned his attention to me, a flicker of defiance in his gaze. "It's just art, you know," he said, his voice tinged with a quiet frustration. "They are acting like it's some kind of crime." I sighed internally. Here we go. "Unfortunately, Mr. Hayes," I began, trying to keep my tone neutral, "the law doesn't always see it that way. The art collector is claiming damages." He stared at me, his brow furrowed. "Damages? It was a gift. They are trying to find a reason to take it all away." There was something in his voice, in the vulnerability that hid behind his bravado, that struck me. It wasn't just frustration, it was something deeper, a quiet desperation that I couldn't quite put my finger on. For the next hour, we went over the details of the case, him telling me about his creative process and the reasons behind the mural. His words spilled out, raw and unfiltered, telling a story of passion, of wanting to bring color and life to a world that felt dull and gray. The more he spoke, the more I found myself drawn to his energy. I had always been surrounded by the rigid rules of the law. Daniel was a breath of fresh, chaotic air. He wasn't just a client, he was a catalyst. As the sun began to set, casting the conference room in soft, orange hues, I noticed him again. He was sketching on a notepad, his hand moving with the ease of someone who had done it 1,000 times. When he paused, his eyes met mine, and for a moment, it felt like there was nothing else in the room but us. I broke the quiet first. "You know," I started, my voice breaking the silence. He looked up, a hint of surprise in his expression. "You've got a real talent." He stared at me for a moment. "Really," he said, as if expecting me to take it back. "Really," I affirmed, "I may be a lawyer, but I'm not blind." He smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes. "Thanks," he said, putting his notepad down. "I was just trying to think of a different way to look at the facts." His tone was light, almost teasing, but I could sense the warmth, the vulnerability hidden just beneath the surface. For the next few weeks, I found myself spending more time than I should in conference room C. I started to look forward to our meetings, his stories about his creative process, the places he'd been, and the people he'd met on his journey. It wasn't just the cases, he was teaching me about another kind of life, one that was vibrant and passionate and completely detached from the rigid world of law. Sometimes he would pace, talking out the details of his most recent creations. Other times he would sit and stare at the wall, thinking, a pencil twirling between his fingers. During one such session he was silent for an extended period of time, staring blankly at the conference room wall. "Long day?" I asked, glancing at the setting sun. He chuckled, a low sound that was laced with a hint of exhaustion. "It is," he agreed, "but the creative process has been calling." "Oh, so you're working on something?" I inquired, trying to keep my tone neutral. He hesitated for a moment before finally speaking. "I'm trying to," he admitted, "but I can't seem to get past what has happened. It's like I'm still locked up." "Locked up in your head?" I offered, already knowing the answer. "That's it exactly, it's all just floating around." His words hung in the air, heavy and unfiltered. I wasn't sure what to say, so I stayed quiet, letting him continue if he wanted. "You know," he added after a moment, "I thought the courtroom was bad, but I realized being unable to create is the actual torture." "I think everyone feels that way at some point," I said finally, my voice soft. "We get so caught up in what we do that we forget to ask what we really want." He turned to look at me, his eyes searching mine. For a moment, I wondered if I'd said too much, but then he nodded, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "You're perceptive for someone so organized," he said, his tone teasing but warm. I laughed lightly, shaking my head. "Or maybe I just see what you're projecting." That made him laugh, a deep, genuine sound that seemed to fill the room. It was the first time I'd seen him let go of the weight he carried, even if only for a moment. It felt like a small victory. As our sessions progressed, we spoke less about the case and more about what truly mattered. His life in the alleys and streets, the inspiration that drove him, his hopes for the future. The more we talked, the more I found myself questioning my own choices. There was something comforting about his presence, like a burst of color in the middle of a black and white photograph. At one point, he leaned back in his chair, his hands clasped behind his head. "It's funny," he said, his voice tinged with nostalgia. "When you're young you think life is about grand moments and wild adventures, but really, it's about those small things, the quiet moments." I nodded, understanding the sentiment even though my experience was so different than his. "Do you ever feel like you missed something?" I asked, the question slipping out before I could stop it. He considered this for a moment, his gaze fixed on the ceiling. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but I try not to dwell on it. Regret doesn't change the past." His honesty was disarming, and I felt a sudden urge to share something of my own. "I think everyone has those moments," I said. "I'm only 34, and I already catch myself wondering if I'm on the right path." Daniel turned to look at me, his expression soft but serious. "You've got time," he said. "More than you realize. Don't let fear stop you from living." His words stayed with me long after he left. There was a wisdom in them, a perspective I hadn't considered before. The days that followed felt like a slow dance between the predictable and the unpredictable. Daniel and I fell into a rhythm as if our lives had always been intertwined this way. Our formal meetings turned into longer conversations over coffee, or impromptu sketching sessions in the courthouse break room. Each time we spoke, it felt like entering a world set apart from everything else, a quiet refuge where time seemed to slow down. Daniel's presence was magnetic. He didn't need to command attention with grand gestures or flashy words. It was in the small things, the way his eyes crinkled when he was amused, the quiet hum of contentment when we were both lost in thought, or the way he leaned forward slightly when I spoke, as though my words were the only ones that mattered. He shared stories of his past, about growing up in a small town, about the moments he realized he wanted to be an artist. His voice carried a mix of nostalgia and longing, as though he were reliving those moments with every word. "I used to think my art was just an escape," he said, swirling the last of his coffee in his cup, "but now I'm not so sure." "What do you mean?" I asked, leaning forward. He met my gaze, his expression thoughtful. "Back then, it was about expressing myself, about feeling alive in a world that felt so dull, but I think the best art comes from something deeper, from a place where you're truly present." There was a vulnerability in his voice. "Where you can be honest with yourself, and with the world." The sincerity in his voice caught me off guard, and I felt a warmth spread through my chest. "I get that," I said quietly. "It's not about the big moments, is it? It's about the little ones." "Exactly," he said, his lips curving into a soft smile, "and lately, it feels like there are more of those little moments." The words hung between us, their meaning unspoken but understood. My heart raced, and I felt a pull toward him that was as undeniable as it was unexpected. I wasn't sure if it was the end of a long day or the way his gaze lingered just a second too long, but something in me shifted. The case continued to drag on, but the world around us seemed to soften and quiet with every meeting. It was no longer about the black and white of the law, but the soft shades of gray that lie in between. I began to see the world through Daniel's eyes, and I realized that life could be more than just structure and order. I started to notice the light in the alleyways, the patterns in the graffiti, the stories hidden in the city walls. One day, as we were wrapping up a session, Daniel invited me to see his work. It was a small, almost casual offer, but something about it felt different. There was a subtle shift in his tone, an undercurrent of anticipation that made my pulse quicken. "I realize I've been stuck in this place," he said with a smile. "Come, let me show you something that might be worth your time." I hesitated, surprised by the sudden shift, but his easy demeanor put me at ease. "Sure," I said, following him out of the courthouse and into the city streets. The alley was exactly as I had imagined it, vibrant, chaotic, and alive. The walls were covered in layers of paint, each stroke telling a story of creativity and rebellion. There was a faint scent of spray paint and the city. It felt lived in, comfortable, a stark contrast to the often sterile atmosphere of the courthouse. "So," he asked, gesturing to the murals that surrounded us, "what do you think?" I took a moment to take it all in, the explosion of colors and shapes, the sheer energy of his work. "It's incredible," I admitted, my voice filled with a mix of awe and admiration. He watched me for a moment, his eyes searching mine. "You know," he began, "I wasn't sure about you at first." I raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Oh. You're so professional. I figured you'd be all about the rules and the laws, that there wouldn't be any time for art." His words caught me off guard, and I found myself searching for a response. "Maybe I just know what it's like to feel limited," I said quietly. "It makes you want to break free." Daniel's gaze softened, his expression thoughtful. "You're a good observer," he said. "It's rare to find someone who sees the world the way you do." There was a weight to his words, a sincerity that made my chest tighten. I wasn't sure where this was going, but something in his eyes told me he wanted something more. "I think sometimes people just need to be seen," I said simply. He nodded, his eyes distant for a moment before returning to mine. "You're right, and it's been a long time since I felt seen." The vulnerability in his voice was palpable, and it tugged at something deep within me. I wanted to tell him that he deserved to be seen, that his thoughts and feelings mattered, but the words felt too heavy to say aloud. Instead, I offered him a small smile, letting the silence fill the space between us. As we walked through the alley, Daniel shared stories about each mural, telling me about the inspiration behind them, the meaning they held for him. The more he talked, the more I realized that we had a lot more in common than I had first anticipated. He had a way of seeing the beauty in the ordinary, of turning the mundane into something magical. At one point he leaned against a brick wall, his hands tucked into his pockets. "It's funny," he said, his voice tinged with nostalgia. "When you're young you think the world is your canvas, but life hits you and you don't know what to do next." I nodded, understanding the sentiment even though my experience was so different than his. "Do you ever feel like you're missing out on something?" I asked, the question slipping out before I could stop it. He considered this for a moment, his gaze fixed on the wall. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but I try not to dwell on it. Regret doesn't change the past." His honesty was disarming, and I felt a sudden urge to share something of my own. "I think everyone has those moments," I said. "I'm only 34, and I already catch myself wondering if I'm on the right path. Daniel looked at me, his expression soft but serious. "You've got time," he said. "More than you realize. Don't let fear stop you from living." His words stayed with me long after I left the alley. There was a wisdom in them, a perspective I hadn't considered before. And as much as I tried to tell myself that it was just a friendly connection, a part of me wondered if it was something more. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Daniel and I found ourselves in my office, surrounded by stacks of legal documents. The air was warm and still, the scent of old paper and printer ink filling the space. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the city lights come on. Finally, Daniel spoke, his voice low and measured. "You know," he said, "I never thought I'd find myself here, sharing quiet moments with a lawyer and talking about life. It's different." I smiled, the sincerity in his words warming me more than the coffee I had just made. "I feel the same way," I admitted. "It's easy to talk to you." He turned to look at me, his gaze lingering for a moment. I thought he might say something more, but he simply nodded, a small smile playing at his lips. The silence that followed wasn't awkward, it was charged, as though we were both waiting for something neither of us could name. In that quiet moment, beneath the fading light, I realized just how much Daniel had come to mean to me. He was not just a client, he was so much more. In some way I was very attracted to him, and I wasn't sure yet, but I think he was attracted to me too. The time that followed felt like a slow dance between the familiar and the unknown. Daniel and I fell into a rhythm as if our lives had always been intertwined this way. Our structured meetings turned into more personal conversations, and soon it became natural for me to be seeking him out. Each time he entered my office, it felt like entering a world set apart from everything else, a quiet refuge where time seemed to slow down. Daniel's presence was magnetic. He didn't need to command attention with grand gestures or flashy words, it was in the small things, the way his eyes widened with childlike wonder when I shared a story, the quiet hum of contentment as he sketched in his notebook, or the way he leaned forward slightly when I spoke, as though my words were the only ones that mattered. He had a way of making me feel seen, of making me feel like I was the only person in the world who understood him. Eventually, he invited me to stay for his latest mural. It was a small gesture, but something about it felt different. There was a subtle shift in his tone, an undercurrent of anticipation that made my pulse quicken. "It's usually a bit messy," he warned with a self-deprecating smile as he set his paints out in the alleyway, "but it's always better with company." I laughed, taking in the sight of him. He wore a relaxed look, not a professional one. The air felt charged, and completely disarming. "This is a very generous offer," I said, taking a seat on a nearby crate. "I know," he replied and shrugged. The remark hung in the air, a quiet nod to the hours he'd spent with me. I wanted to understand more, but the vulnerability in his eyes held me back. As we sat there, talking, the conversation flowed as easily as ever. He shared stories of his younger days, impulsive travels, and nights spent under the stars. His voice carried a mix of nostalgia and longing, as though he were reliving those moments with every word. "I used to think those were the best days of my life," he said, swirling the last of his paint in his container, "but now I'm not so sure." "What do you mean?" I asked, leaning forward. He met my gaze, his expression thoughtful. "Back then, it was all about chasing the next thrill, the next high, but I think the best days are the ones where you're truly present." There was a vulnerability in his voice. Where you can sit across from someone and just feel at peace. The sincerity in his voice caught me off guard, and I felt a warmth spread through my chest. "I get that," I said quietly. "It's not about the big moments, is it? It's about the little ones." "Exactly," he said, his lips curving into a soft smile, "and lately, it feels like there are more of those little moments." The words hung between us, their meaning unspoken but understood. My heart raced, and I felt a pull toward him that was as undeniable as it was unexpected. I wasn't sure if it was the end of a long day or the way his gaze lingered just a second too long, but something in me shifted. As Daniel finished the last strokes of the mural, the alley came alive with a vibrancy that was impossible to ignore. The colors danced and played, telling a story that was both personal and universal. We stood there, bathed in the soft light of the street lamps, the silence between us heavy with meaning. "This has been different," Daniel said, his voice low. "Thank you." "You don't have to thank me," I said, my voice softer than I intended. "You made it easy." He chuckled softly, the sound warm and genuine. "You make it easy too." The moment stretched between us, the silence thick with unspoken emotions. I could feel the tension in the air, the magnetic pull that seemed to draw us closer with every passing second. Then, without thinking, I reached out, letting my fingers brush against his. His hand stilled under mine, and for a moment, I worried I'd crossed a line. But then, he turned his hand over, his palm meeting mine, his fingers curling gently around mine. The contact sent a jolt of electricity through me, and I felt my breath hitch. "Daniel," I began, my voice barely above a whisper. He shook his head, his thumb brushing against the back of my hand. "It's okay," he said softly. "You don't have to say anything." His words were both a reassurance and an invitation, and I felt my resolve crumble. The space between us seemed to shrink, and before I knew it, I was leaning closer, drawn to the warmth of his presence. When our lips finally met, it was tentative, a careful exploration of the emotions we had both been holding back. His touch was gentle but firm, his hands cupping my face as he kissed me with a ferocity that matched my own. His tongue slipped between my lips, and I moaned into his mouth, my hands tangling in his hair. It wasn't rushed or frantic, it was steady, deliberate, and filled with a depth of feeling that left me breathless. When we finally pulled apart, his forehead rested against mine, his breath warm against my skin. "I didn't think this was possible," he admitted, his voice tinged with disbelief. "Neither did I said, my voice shaky but honest. "But I'm glad it is." For the first time in a long time, I felt completely at ease, as though I'd found a place where I belonged. As I stood there, wrapped in the quiet comfort of Daniel's presence, I knew that whatever came next, I was ready to face it with him. And I knew that this was not over. It was the beginning of something bigger than I could have ever imagined. The night carried a serene weight, as though the universe itself had paused to take a breath. Daniel and I remained in the alley, the soft glow of the streetlights casting warm shadows on his face. His eyes lingered on mine, a mix of gratitude and trepidation swimming in their depths. I could sense the hesitation in him, the years of wandering and freedom that threatened to pull him back. "Are you okay?" I asked softly, my hands still resting in his. He nodded, exhaling slowly. "I am," he admitted, it's been a long time since I let myself feel this way." I smiled, understanding the courage it must have taken for him to admit that. "Me too," I said, though my experience with vulnerability paled in comparison to his. "But I think we deserve this, don't you?" Daniel's lips curved into a faint smile, but the weight in his eyes remained. "I spent so many years convincing myself that there was only one way to live, that the roles we play, artist, friend, nomad, define us entirely, but lately," he trailed off, his gaze drifting to the mural that now seemed to come to life with the city lights. "Lately?" I prompted, leaning in slightly. "Lately I've been wondering what else there is," he said, turning back to me, "what it might mean to choose something for myself, to feel something just because I want to." His words hung between us, heavy with meaning. I squeezed his hand gently, anchoring him to the moment. "You can," I said simply, "and you don't have to apologize for it." He closed his eyes briefly, as though absorbing the truth of my words. When he opened them again, there was a quiet determination in his gaze. "You're something else," he said, his voice low and filled with a warmth that sent a shiver through me. We stood there for a while, the silence between us filled with the kind of understanding that didn't need words. I could feel the shift in him, the way his shoulders relaxed, and his grip on my hand steadied. He wasn't fighting it anymore, he was allowing himself to be present, to let the moment unfold without resistance. Then, without thinking, Daniel pulled me closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Do you want to?" He hesitated, glancing towards his van. I felt a jolt of adrenaline shoot through me. The idea was reckless, impulsive, but it was impossible to ignore the desire that was building between us. "Yes," I said, my voice just as low, "I do." He led me towards his van, his hand in mine. My heart pounded as he opened the door. The space was small, the air thick with the scent of paint and adventure. But in that moment it felt like the only place in the world where we could truly exist. I turned, and Daniel was there, his eyes dark with want. He didn't say anything, just reached for me, his hands cupping my face as he kissed me with a ferocity that matched my own. His tongue slipped between my lips, and I moaned into his mouth, my hands tangling in his hair. We fumbled, the narrow space making everything feel more urgent. He pulled my shirt out of my trousers, his fingers brushing across my skin, sending shivers down my spine. I reached for his belt, and he groaned when I undid it, his eyes never leaving mine. The city sounds faded, and we held each other tighter, our bodies moving in perfect sync. The intensity built, a crescendo of sensation that left us both gasping for breath. As we reached the peak, I squeezed my eyes shut, letting go of everything but the moment. We lay there, panting, our bodies pressed together, the city sounds a distant hum. When we finally pulled apart, it was with a sense of disbelief. Daniel started, his voice shaky. "Don't," I said, pressing a finger to his lips. "Just, don't." We stayed like that for a few minutes, the small space holding our secret. Then, with a last lingering look, we straightened our clothes, and stepped back into the real world. As we made our way back to my office, I felt as if the world had shifted on its axis. I knew that whatever came next, I was ready to face it with him. And I knew that this was not over. It was the beginning of something bigger than I could have ever imagined. The morning light filtered softly through my office window, casting a golden hue over the legal documents. I woke to the quiet sounds of the city, my head resting against Daniel's chest, his arms still draped around me, his breathing deep and even, a peaceful rhythm that made the world feel safe. For a moment, I stayed perfectly still, savoring the tranquility of the moment. It felt like the kind of morning I'd always hoped for, simple, quiet, and filled with a sense of belonging. Eventually, Daniel stirred, his eyes fluttering open. As he looked down at me, a slow, warm smile spread across his face. And he gave a soft chuckle. "Good morning," he said, his voice still heavy with sleep. "Morning," I replied, feeling my cheeks warm under his gaze. He reached up, brushing a strand of hair from my forehead. "I can't remember the last time I woke up feeling this content," he admitted, his voice tinged with vulnerability. "Me neither," I said, smiling back at him. "This feels right." "It does," he agreed, his expression softening more than I ever expected it would. We stayed like that for a while, the weight of the world kept at bay by the stillness of the moment. There was no rush, no need to fill the silence with words. Everything we needed to say was spoken in the way we held each other, in the way his hand absent-mindedly traced circles on my arm, in the way our breaths synchronized as if our bodies had found their own rhythm together. Eventually, hunger began to creep in, and Daniel reluctantly pulled away. "I think I owe you breakfast," he said with a grin, sitting up and stretching. "You don't owe me anything," I said, following him to the kitchenette, "but I'm not going to say no to your cooking." He laughed, the sound light and free, as he rummaged through the fridge. "How do you feel about takeout?" "Perfect," I replied, taking a seat at my desk. As he worked, I watched him with a sense of quiet admiration. There was something grounding about the way he moved, his actions steady and purposeful. It reminded me of why I had been drawn to him in the first place, his quiet strength, his ability to make even the simplest moments feel meaningful. When he placed the small containers in front of me, the aroma of fresh coffee filled the air. "I wanted to make this morning special," he said, his tone earnest. "You did," I assured him, "more than you know." After breakfast, we found ourselves back in the office, the weight of the previous night still hanging in the air, but in a way that felt comforting rather than heavy. Daniel leaned back in his chair, his gaze distant for a moment before he spoke. "I never thought I'd feel this way again," he said, his voice quiet but steady. "For so long, I convinced myself that part of my life was over, that it wasn't something I could have anymore." I reached out, placing a hand on his knee. "You can," I said firmly, "and you deserve to." His eyes met mine, and there was a rawness there that made my chest tighten. "It's scary," he admitted, "letting myself feel this way, letting myself want this." "I know," I said softly, "but you're not doing it alone." He nodded, his expression softening. "I don't think I could have done this without you. You've made me realize that it's okay to want more, to want something for myself." I leaned in, resting my forehead against his. "And you've shown me what it means to truly connect with someone, to see them for who they are, not who they think they have to be." The moment lingered, the silence between us heavy with unspoken promises. When we finally pulled apart, it was with a sense of quiet resolution. This wasn't just a fleeting connection, it was the start of something that had the power to change us both. As the day wore on, we talked about the future, not in grand sweeping terms, but in the small, meaningful ways that made all the difference. We spoke of shared meals in the city, lazy evenings sketching together, and the kind of companionship that made even the most ordinary moment feel extraordinary. By the time the day ended, I felt a sense of peace that I hadn't known was possible. Daniel stood beside me as we watched the sunset, his hand in mine as we watched the world slow down around us. "You know," he said after a while, his voice soft, "I used to think my best days were behind me, but now I'm starting to believe they might still be ahead." I smiled, leaning my head against his shoulder. "They are," I said confidently, "and I'll be right here with you." We stayed like that as the last rays of sunlight dipped below the horizon. The weight of the past no longer felt so heavy, and the uncertainty of the future didn't feel so daunting. All that mattered was the here and now, and the quiet promise of what was to come. I still feel good about what I did. Helping out an artist is what we do, don't we? Well, whatever he needs.